Hey guys, in this video looking at power and conflict poetry, focusing on the poem Exposure, which was written by Wilfred Owen. So it was written in 1917 whilst he was serving in the trenches of Old World War One. Owen was a soldier poet. He wanted to expose the pity of war and the harsh reality of life at the front, contrasting with patriotic propaganda back home. It's based on the brutal winter of 1917, the coldest in living memory. It follows soldiers as they lie in the freezing mud, not fighting an enemy army, but struggling to survive the relentless, agonizing power of the weather. The main message is that war is the slow psychological and physical erosion rather than a series of heroic battles. The poem highlights that nature and time are stronger than humans, as the wind and frost are more lethal than the bullets that shriek the silence. The iced east winds and the refrain, but nothing happens, symbolize the futility and boredom of war. The irony exposes the rulers' foolishness of the military leaders for sending men to die in a conflict where they are ultimately defeated by the landscape before they even see the enemy. Key ideas. So, key ideas are man versus nature. The soldiers are under siege by the elements. The knives of wind and pale flakes that fingering stealthily at faces prove that nature and time is stronger than humans, reducing proud soldiers to cringing animals. Looks at the psychological toll of waiting. So, the real enemy is the sentry's whisper and the wearied minds of the men. Their power is temporary as the memories of home and crickets fade, replaced by a shriveling of their spirits. Looks at the inadequacy of patriotism. So the soldiers believe their sacrifice is for love of God, yet they feel abandoned. Their pride leads to downfall as they realize that the doors are closed on their old lives and nothing happens to justify their suffering. It looks at the cycle of futility. So the poem's repetitive structure and the recurring but nothing happens suggests that war is an endless static nightmare. It mocks the idea of a glorious victory, showing that irony exposes the ruler's foolishness in thinking war has an easy or heroic end. Structure of the poem. So it's in 8 stanzas of equal length, known as quintets, and the rigid repetitive structure reflects the monotonous, never-ending nature of the soldier's weight. It's A-B-B-A-C rhyme scheme with para rhyme, and here Owen uses half rhymes, for example, knife, us, nervous, faces, and fusses, to create a sense of unease and incompleteness. This reflects a world out of sync, where nature and time are stronger than humans. It's got ellipses and caesura, so the frequent use of dots and midline stops creates a slow, dragging pace. This mimics the gasping breath of freezing men and the agonizing passage of time. Then it's got the refrain, but nothing happens, which concludes the first, third, fourth, and final stanzas. It emphasizes the irony that exposes the ruler's foolishness, highlighting that despite the immense suffering, there is no progress or meaning. Context of the poem. So it looks at the reality of trench warfare. So Owen wrote the poem to counter the old lie, which was dulce et decorum est. He focused on the misery of the salient, where more men died of exposure and disease than in actual combat. It looks at the winter of 1917. So the extreme conditions described were literal. Soldiers were freed to death in their sleep, which Owen portrays as a blank desertion by both God and humanity. Looks at religious doubt. So the line "for love of God is dying" suggests that the horror of war makes faith impossible. The pride leads to downfall of Western religious and moral certainty in the face of such senseless slaughter. It also looks at anti-propaganda, so it's written during a time of heavy censorship, and the poem was a radical attempt to tell the truth to the British public, who were protected from the darkness of the front lines. Here is a poem. So here's a poem. You're welcome to pause the video and have a little read, and press play when you want to continue. Let's do a line-by-line analysis. Our brains ache in the merciless ice-east winds that knife us, its personification and sibilance, and the merciless wind is presented as a sentient enemy. The S sounds mimic the whistling of the wind, showing that nature and time is stronger than humans. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent, has alliteration, and the W sounds create a heavy, exhausted tone. The silence is not peaceful, it is wearied and tense. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient, has visual imagery, and the flares distort reality, showing how the soldiers' power is temporary as they lose their grip on where they are. Worried by silence, sentries whisper. Curious, nervous, has an asymptotic list, and the rapid succession of adjectives shows the soldier's heightened state of anxiety and paranoia. But nothing happens is refrain, which is repeated throughout to show the futility of their situation. The irony exposes the ruler's foolishness. They are prepared for a battle that never comes, while they die of cold. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire has auditory imagery. Nature is described as mad, suggesting a chaotic force that cannot be reasoned with. Like twitching agonies of men among its brambles has a simile, and it compares the wind and the barbed wire to dying men, showing how the environment is saturated with death. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow as personification, and usually dawn symbolizes hope, but here it is poignant misery. This subverts expectations of a new day. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy, has a root of three, and the simple, bleak verbs show that the reality has been reduced to basic physical suffering. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, has a military metaphor and shows nature is a real army. The grey of the sky is more threatening than the grey of German uniforms. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, has sibilance and contrast, so the S sounds mimic bullets, but the poet explicitly states that nature is more deadly than man-made weapons. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew, has alliteration onomatopoeia, so the F sounds and rhythmic verbs make the snow seem like a living predatory creature. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces has personification and fricative alliteration. So the snow is fingering and feeling, like a cold hand looking for a pulse. It highlights that nature and time is stronger than humans. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams and stare, snow days is a metaphor, and the soldiers are reduced to animals which are cringing in holes. Their forgotten dreams show that their pride leads to downfall as they lose their humanity. Deep into grassier ditches, so we drowse, sundoze as assonance, and the O sounds create a lethargic, sleepy tone, suggesting the onset of hypothermia. Littered with blossoms trickling while the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying as a juxtaposition? The beautiful image of spring blossoms is placed next to the black reality of death. The rhetorical question marks their final loss of hope. Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glowed with crickets jingle in a metaphor. They are already ghosts. They are hallucinating the warmth of hope, but the sunk fires suggest that life is going on without them. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. A symbolism. As the mice nature have reclaimed a home, it reinforces that nature and time is stronger than humans, as nature survives whilst men perish. Shutters and doors, all closed. On us, the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying, has repetition and a metaphor, and the closed doors symbolize how society has abandoned them. The isolation is absolute. Since we believe not otherwise, can kind fires burn, nor ever sun's smile true on child, or field, or fruit, is a religious and sacrificial language, as here the soldiers try to find meaning in their death, but the tone is doubtful. For love of God is dying is a blasphemous metaphor as the ultimate loss of faith. Their suffering is so great that they can no longer believe in a kind creator. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, and this is fricative alliteration, as the F sounds emphasize the physical sensation of freezing. We are being fastened and trapped by nature. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens, has a metaphor and refrain. The ice suggests both literal freezing and a loss of soul and emotion. The final nothing happens is the ultimate irony that exposes the rulers' foolishness. Their death changed nothing. Section by section analysis then. So lines 1 to 5 look at the frozen vigil, and what happens is the soldiers lie awake in the trenches during a freezing night. They're exhausted and terrified, listening to the mad wind in the barbed wire whilst waiting for an attack that never comes. The effect of this is that the merciless environment is established as a more immediate threat than the enemy's shoulders. They refrain, but nothing happens, creates a sense of futility, suggesting that the irony exposes the ruler's foolishness. The men are prepared for battle, but are being defeated by the weather. The techniques to highlight is personification and sibilance. Lines 6 to 20 look at nature as the army. What happens is dawn arrives, but instead of bringing hope, it brings more cold and storms. The poet describes the weather using military language, showing that the wind and snow are the real enemy. The effect of this is that by describing the clouds as a melancholy army, Owen shows that nature and time are stronger than humans. The soldiers realize that the air is less deadly than the bullets, highlighting the shift from a human conflict to a struggle against a superior natural force. Techniques to highlight are military metaphors, alliteration, and contrast. Lines 21 to 20 show the hallucination. What happens is as the men succumb to hypothermia, they begin to hallucinate about spring, home, and warmth. However, they feel closed off from this world, realizing they are dying. The fingering stealth of snow shows nature's predatory side. Their forgotten dreams suggest that power is temporary and the identities of soldiers and men are being erased by the cold. The question, is it that we are dying, marks the moment pride leads to downfall and total vulnerability. Main techniques to highlight here are personification, juxtaposition, and rhetorical question. Lines 31 to 40 show the moral death, and what happens is the soldiers lose their faith in God and feel abandoned by society. The frost eventually fastens on them, and the poem ends with the burial party finding their bodies with eyes as eyes. What happens is the closed doors symbolize how the people at home have forgotten them. The final image of eyes at eyes show the total triumph of nature over man. The repetition of one thing happens reinforces the irony that exposes the ruler's foolishness, as the men have died for a cause that has left them static and forgotten. The main techniques here are metaphor, fricative alliteration, and cyclical refrain. Let's look at the overall interpretation. So, Wilfred Owen's exposure explores a profound disconnect between the patriotic myth of heroic war and the agonizing reality of soldiers being destroyed by the natural world. Through a rigid, repetitive structure and the subversion of traditional nature imagery, the poem depicts soldiers as haunted, cringing figures who bear the psychological and physical burden of witnessing the merciless power of the elements while their sense of duty vanishes. The poem suggests that war leaves an indelible ice on the human soul, transforming the innocent hope of home into forgotten dreams that no longer offer comfort. By the end, the realization that nothing happens reveals a bitter truth that human power is temporary and pride leads to downfall as the soldiers are defeated by the weather rather than the enemy. The blank indifference of the universe confirms that nature and time is stronger than humans, leaving the witness in a state of permanent ice-cold realization. The irony exposes the ruler's foolishness, showing that the glory of war is a lie that ends in a shriveled and forgotten death. Here's a comparison checklist for the essays. So if you're using this poem, you make sure you look at these points. So the passive victim. Unlike the active, lusty rower in the prelude, the soldiers are trapped and motionless, yet both are equally haunted by nature's dominance. Looks at nature as the antagonist. So the contrast between the melancholy army of the clouds and the less deadly bullets of man. Order versus chaos. So the use of a rigid A-standard structure to contain the mad chaos of the storm and the slow disintegration of the soldiers' minds. The spiritual collapse, so the loss of faith where love of God is dying, mirrors the blank desertion in the prelude, proving that extreme nature destroys human certainty. And then the futility of status. So the eyes at the end show that power is temporary, whether a king, rower, or soldier, all are eventually reduced to the same mud by nature. Let's look at what comparison poems you can compare with exposure. So we can compare exposure with Storm on the Island. Here are the similarities. So it looks at nature as a primary antagonist. In both poems, the real enemy isn't a human soldier, but the elements. In exposure, the iced east winds are described as kniving the men. In Storm on the Island, the wind pummels the houses. Both poets present nature as a calculated, aggressive attacker. Another similarity is powerlessness of man. So both poems depict humans huddling together for survival against an overwhelming force. Owen's soldiers cringe in holes, whilst Heaney's islanders squat and wait for the gale to pass. Both emphasize that human structures, trenches, or stone houses offer little protection against the natural world. Another similarity is the subversion of the sublime. So traditionally, nature is seen as beautiful or spiritual. Here it is terrifying. Owen describes a melancholy army of grey clouds, and Heaney describes the sea as a tame cat turned savage. They both use imagery to turn the familiar world into a nightmare. Differences are the physicality of the conflict. So in exposure, nature is a silent, freezing killer that slowly drains life out of the men. Our brains ache. In Storm on the Island, nature is a loud, chaotic explosion of noise and movement. It is a huge nothing that we fear, emphasizing the auditory terror of a storm versus the quiet misery of the trenches. Another difference is literal versus metaphorical war. So Owen's poem is rooted in the literal reality of World War I, as the cold is a deadly addition to the cells and bullets. Heaney's poem, while describing a storm, is often interpreted as a metaphor for the troubles in Northern Ireland, the storm of political violence, where the island represents a community trying to withstand it. Another difference is the outcome of the conflict. So exposure ends in hopelessness and death, as the soldiers are turning back to our dying, and the final line, but nothing happens, just a cycle of meaningless suffering. Storm on the Island ends with a sense of resilience. Despite the fear, the islanders are prepared and have built their houses squat to endure, suggesting that while nature is powerful, community endurance is possible. Another comparison is exposure versus charge of the Light Brigade. So a similarity is the inevitability of death. Both poems present soldiers trapped in a situation where they're likely to die. Tennyson describes 600 riding into the mouth of hell, while Owen describes men turning back to our dying. In both, the soldiers are cogs in a machine they cannot stop. Another similarity is a criticism of leadership. So both poets hint that the soldiers' suffering is a result of human error. Tennyson explicitly mentions someone had blundered, while Owen's repetitive but nothing happens suggests a frustrating lack of purpose or strategy from those in charge. Another similarity is the use of refrains. So both poems use repetitive structures to mirror the feeling of being trapped. Tennyson uses Roll the 600 to create a rhythmic, horse-like pace, while Owen uses But Nothing Happens to create a stagnant, suffocating atmosphere. My difference is glory versus futility. This is the biggest divide. So Tennyson's poem is a hymn to heroism as he uses active verbs, for example, charged, plunged, shattered, to make the soldiers seem like legends. Owen's poem is an elegy of futility, so his verbs are passive, for example, cringe, doze, shriveling, to show that there is no glory in freezing to death. Another difference is the sound of war. So Tennyson uses dactylic dimeter, which is a strong, weak beat to mimic the heroic thundering of horses' hooves. It is loud and exciting. Owen, however, uses irregular rhythms and half rhymes, like nervous and nervous, to create a sense of unease, discord, and physical discomfort. Another difference is the enemy. So in charge, the enemy is human and visible. As for example, Cossack and Russian. There is someone to fight, but in exposure, the enemy is invisible and environmental. The bullets are less deadly than the fingers of sorrow, for example, the snow. Owen argues that the weather is a more efficient killer than the opposing army. Here are some key quotes to revise for exposure. So, our brains ache, and the merciless ice steeds winds that knife us is personification and sibilance. The wind is a cruel attacker. The S sounds create a cutting, cold atmosphere, proving that nature and time is stronger than humans. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more, is a military metaphor as nature is a true enemy army. This subverts the idea of a new day as hope, showing that power is temporary against the elements. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air, is sibilance and contrast as the S sounds mimic bullets, but the poet explicitly states that nature's cold is a greater killer. Pale flakes with fingering styles come feeling for our faces. Its personification, as the snow is a predatory, ghostly figure, it highlights the vulnerability of the men and proves pride leads to downfall as they cringe and hold. For love of God is dying is a metaphor suggesting a total collapse of faith and spirit. The soldiers feel abandoned, proving the irony exposes the ruler's foolishness, as the glory they were promised has vanished. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. It's metaphor and refrain, as the ice represents literal death and emotional numbness. The repetition emphasizes the futility of the sacrifice and that power is temporary.